So good afternoon. We're going to try to get started as trying to get some of you that came on time. I'm Edwin Asturias. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Global Health. And today it's a great honor really to have Ambassador Christopher Hill here with us. He's the current Dean of the Joseph Korbel School for International Affairs at the UDenver, I should say, and trying to absorb it into the mergers now. You know, it's a great honor because he has a great trajectory as a diplomat for the State Department and serving this country, and he has served in his last position in Iraq and then also in the South Pacific and the Southeast Asia region. So I think a person that has a lot of experience in conflicts and countries in trouble around the world and gives us a very important global perspective. I always get questioned by why the Center for Global Health will bring somebody that has this perspective on diplomacy and interaction with other countries. And one good example, especially that refers to his talk today, is Syria, where for example, the current conflict in Syria that has been going on for 3 years has had a huge impact in polio eradication now. So we know that one of the countries that last year it became endemic again, or not endemic, but at least epidemic in terms of polio, for example, was Syria, due to our inability to really reach those vulnerable populations and getting vaccinated. So just a good perspective that whenever you have countries in trouble, will have issues with health that are very interrelated. So Ambassador Hill, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm from the University of Denver, which goes DU, so there's some sort of dyslexia here, but I think it also happens with CU, right? So it's University of Colorado. I don't quite understand how that happened. About 2 weeks ago today, we had via Skype, we had one of our alums, that is the foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif. And he spoke to us from a hotel room in Vienna just after the first day of negotiations with the so-called P5+1, that is the U.S., Britain, France, Russia, China, and Germany. And so as our alum, he was willing to get on a Skype, and so we had him on some giant screen. And you always worry about the technology, but it did hold, and we were able to have this conversation for about an hour and 15 minutes. And so, and we had a couple of satellite trucks there, including one from CNN. So I walk out of it's the university's library, now called an academic commons, because I guess no one reads anymore or something, so they just talk. So anyway, we walk out of the academic commons, and I get word that Wolf Blitzer on the Situation Room wants to interview me. So I don't know if you know how that works, but basically you get a little thing in your ear, and then there's a camera, and your trick is to just look at this little lens at the camera all the time. You never want to look away, because then you look shifty-eyed. So anyway, I'm waiting for the first question on what was kind of a groundbreaking thing, because I don't think Javad Zarif has had an opportunity to talk to any American audiences and talk about, where Iran is going with the nuclear talks, where it might go with U.S. relations, what are the attitudes to Israel, what's the internal human rights situation. So I covered all of those issues. So then Wolf Blitzer gets on, and he says, well, we're very pleased to have here Ambassador Chris Hill, who will help us make sense of the situation in Ukraine. So I think I'm going to some extent, kind of wrong foot you as well, and maybe talk a little about Ukraine, because it is such an important issue in these days, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. But I think it also is important to talk about the situation in Syria, because that is another one that seems to have no end. And I think when it does finally end, or when the situation in Syria finally, the war ends, when the situation in Ukraine finally ends, it will be a product, really, of some countries coming together and trying to work out some sort of political or diplomatic way forward. I think too often, and this is, I think, especially true after the wars in Iraq and the war and in Afghanistan, I think too often there's been a tendency in the United States to conflate these foreign policy issues with security and military issues. And yet I think it is pretty clear that we don't have a military way forward in Syria, and we certainly don't have a military way forward in Ukraine. So usually when you don't have a military way forward, you go for some sort of diplomatic process forward. But that's not before the American media, the American government, the American opposition to the government has sort of used every pejorative adjective, every epithet they can think of for the person who is causing the problem. Certainly Bashir al-Assad is not a very nice person. I don't recommend inviting him to your office Christmas party anytime soon. I mean, this is a rather heinous dictator. But I think when you, rather than launch all these invectives about him, I think it would be better if we kind of focused on what the way forward might be. And I mention that because early on in the Syrian crisis, there was a kind of a perception that the administration, the Obama administration, was a tad bit slow about saying that Hosni Mubarak must go, the Egyptian president. Now, no question at all that Hosni Mubarak had outlived his shelf life, especially if you're an Egyptian. At the same time, for better or worse, the U.S. had worked with Mubarak on a lot of issues. People often talk about the kind of cooperation we had on the Arab-Israel disputes, but there are many other issues where we worked with Mubarak. He had done a lot of things for our country, which probably will never be known, but they often have to do with dealing with international terrorism, etc. So Mubarak did a lot of things. He didn't do them in necessarily the way we would like to see them done, but he took a lot of bad people off the board, let me put it that way. So, so when the United States was a little bit slower than other countries in saying that Mubarak had to go, clearly what was going on through the minds of our leadership, the President's mind, Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, the CIA, the Defense Department, etc., was that Mubarak had been very useful to us. We don't really want to be the first to pull the plug. Because the next time you have some friend like Mubarak and you need him to do some things, I mean, what you're basically trying to tell these people is, you know, if we can work together, we'll always stick up for you. We'll always be your buddy. And, you know, to try to sort of build some trust, you know, this is not a very, you know, for people planning to become saints, it's not a business I would necessarily recommend you get into. I mean, it's a tough business when you're dealing with people who are, you know, not very nice and certainly don't share many of the values you have. And there was a case with Mubarak. So the administration took a lot of heat for being slow on Mubarak, and so slow to pull the plug on our support for him. So with the next crisis coming up, which was Syria, the feeling was, well, let's compensate a little for the slowness we showed in dealing with Mubarak. Well, let's kind of jump the gun a little on dealing with Bashir al-Assad. After all, unlike Mubarak, Assad had never done the United States any favors. Frankly, Assad has been one of the worst in the region. He's been an implacable foe of Israel. He has not helped the United States through this very, very difficult terrain in Iraq. He hasn't played well with other partners that we've had. He was, at one point, he invaded Lebanon. I mean, he's basically a pretty despicable guy. Plus, he has about one of the worst human rights records, I think, anywhere in the region. So I think for a lot of reasons, but mainly the reason that if we say he's going to go and then he leaves in a couple of weeks, we look pretty much like geniuses. We're not going to deal with this guy, you know, and lo and behold, he's gone. The only trouble with that was he didn't go. and that was getting on about 2 years ago, and he's still there. And the question I think one can reasonably ask is, were we successful in marginalizing Assad, or did maybe we marginalize ourselves? And I think the basic problem was that we had a vision of the Arab Spring that did not really comport with the reality of the Arab Spring, or Arab thing, if you will. So we had this vision of the Arab Spring being a bunch of people who'd had enough of autocratic rule, and that bunch of people, often in demonstrations in front of government buildings, really yearned for greater freedoms, yearned for a better economy. I mean, everyone wants a better economy, but they basically looked to have a country that was more like us, more democratic. And so I think we kind of saw that in Israel, and in Egypt, when you looked at the crowds in Tahrir Square and very urbanized people who clearly wanted, Egypt has been a culture for thousands of years, and to live under this sort of semi-military dictator Mubarak, you can understand why people wanted greater freedoms. Syria, I submit to you, was a little bit different, and it was different not because there weren't any people there who wanted democracy. There were plenty of people who had it with Assad and wanted to see a more civil society, more democracy. But I submit to you the issue is far more complex, and it has to do with what Syria is in the first place. And whenever you want to get rid of a dictator, and you say, how do we get rid of that guy? I suggest to you that should be your second question. Your first question should be, how did that guy get there in the first place? Very useful question to ask, because the answer to that question will help inform the answer to the second question. And lo and behold, what we saw in Syria was a little bit, ironically, kind of a mirror opposite of what we saw in Iraq. In Iraq, you had a country that's some 60% Shia, Arab Shia, some 20-something% Arab Sunni, and some 20% or so Kurdish, who are mainly Sunni but think of themselves more as Kurds than as Sunnis. In fact, Kurds in Iraq don't support Arab Sunnis in the southern part of Iraq. So you had a situation where Iraq, for years and years, was ruled by the Sunni minority. The last great Sunni minority leader was someone named Saddam Hussein. So when we went into Iraq, we essentially flipped it and made it Shia-led, because Shia are 60%. And I wish Shia would divide themselves into, people who believe in big government or small government, or, low taxes or high taxes, etc. But Shia vote for Shia, Sunni vote for Sunni, Kurds vote for Kurds, etc. So we essentially took a country that was undemocratically run by a Sunni minority and made it a Shia majority, so-called democracy. The only trouble is the Shia hadn't ever run the place before, and the Sunni had never been run before, and the rest of the Sunni Arab world hated Iraq for the fact that it became a Shia-led country. We can talk about that later. But then when you start looking at Syria, you say, well, what's the majority there? Well, unlike in Iraq, where the Sunnis have some 20%, the Sunnis have some 60% in Syria. And so why aren't the 60% Sunnis running the country if they believe in themselves as Sunnis? Well, one answer is the Sunnis were kind of divided, and you have sectarian Sunnis, you have much more of a secular group of Sunnis, many of whom, by the way, did support Assad. So you have a little sort of division within the Sunni ranks. Plus you have a regime that was essentially installed decades ago, or helped to be installed by European powers who had an interest in seeing the Alawite tribe, 15%, even smaller than the Sunnis in Iraq, but 15% essentially running Syria. So this small group, Alawites, and I hasten to add some Sunnis joined it, especially those who believed in, who are not sectarian Sunnis, more the guys with the mustaches and not with the beards. They were part of that power structure in Syria. And you also had Christians, Druze, and Kurds in Syria, all of whom supported this minority Alawite government, essentially because they didn't want to be run by a Sunni majority, because they didn't trust who would emerge out of that Sunni majority. Now, I mention all this kind of boring stuff because essentially what I've just described has been Syria for decades and remains Syria today. So you have to ask yourself the question, why would anybody be supporting Assad? I mean, this is someone who, whether he personally did it or allowed it to be done or whatever, he had 2 units in his army fire chemical weapons at essentially civilians. I mean, this is truly a crime by any standard. These are banned weapons for the last 100 years. Not even Nazi Germany used these weapons in war. So there are good reasons why you don't want to deal with Assad. The trouble is that in getting rid of Assad, we, the United States, or in saying we wouldn't deal with Assad, we ended up dealing with the so-called Syrian rebels, otherwise known as Syrian Sunnis, who want to take over the country and can't quite agree on how to do it. So the United States spent a lot of time in conference rooms in the State Department trying to get this opposition, such as it was, to unify and get together. For example, there's the Syrian National Army, and they came out of this Sunni opposition, but they don't work well with the members of the Syrian opposition who are Wahhabist, or Salafite, to use another term for Saudi Wahhabis. The Saudis have helped the Wahhabi, but have not helped the Syrian National Army. It's been quite a mess out there in the battlefield. There are Americans who've said, well, why don't we give aid to the good guys? Well, that sounds like a very nice idea, to give weapons to these guys and not to these guys. The trouble is, think of it as sort of a set of checkpoints, and you're driving your truck with your weapons. Say, well, we've got weapons not for you, but for the next brigade over there. And he goes, okay, you're going to deliver the weapons over there, you give half to me. And that's how it works. And I've seen this in the Balkans. Believe me, it's a nasty business. So you end up cutting deals with people that you didn't really want to cut deals with in the first place. And before you know it, you have kind of a real difficult task of getting weapons. But I submit to you that what Syria needs is not more weapons. There are a lot of weapons in Syria. What Syria needs is a political way forward. Because having a dictator representing an Alawite tribe is not a political way forward, because the only way that dictator can operate is to essentially brutalize the vast majority of the population, which is what Assad has done. But at the same time, to just try to level the battlefield with more weapons to the opposition is to say to Kurds, Druze, Christians, all of whom are supporting Assad, and not because they like Assad, but because they worry what it's going to look like in the future. So you've got to articulate what the future is for these people who are still in foxholes and trenches, fighting in a war. And why are they risking their lives? Because they don't trust the other guys when they finally take over the country. So people always say to me, isn't Syria just like Bosnia? Because I was involved with the Bosnian peace settlement back in 1995. Because after all, you have all these civilians being killed. In Bosnia, the estimation was something on the order of 100 to 200,000 people. Syria, it's kind of a similar picture right now. And so isn't this just like Bosnia? And the way we solved Bosnia was we finally came in with U.S. military or airstrikes against the Serbs, and voila, we ended up and solved the problem. That sounds good, except that's not what happened. What happened was that the contact group, consisting of the U.S., Britain, France, Russia, Germany, UN representation and European Union representation, we all got together, not me personally, but we with the United States, we all got together in the summer of '94, and we figured out something called the Contact Group Plan. And so by the time we got to Dayton, Ohio, which is where we had the actual peace negotiations, by the time we got to Dayton, Ohio, it wasn't something we were starting from scratch. We had a peace plan, and so Dayton, the Dayton peace process, was an effort to implement that plan. You needed a constitution, you needed certain rights for minorities, because rights for minorities, I can tell you, are a completely elusive concept in that part of the world, the majority rules. They got that part of democracy, they just didn't get the Mayflower Compact part of democracy, where minorities also have rights. So we had to articulate all of that and work that into the Constitution, work that into other documents, such that, you know, Bosnia, I'm not going to give you a Chamber of Commerce speech on Bosnia because it really has a lot of problems, but at least people aren't killing each other today. And they do have issues that they need to deal with. So I submit that what we really need in Syria is not more weapons on the ground, nor frankly, do we need so-called provisional elections for a provisional government? Now, I know, you know, we all love elections. We have a set of them coming up this fall. Elections are great. The trouble is, elections in the absence of any democratic structures, of any democratic institutions, are not so great because there is really no point in having an election. The reason you need what an election would do for you in Syria is to tell you how many Kurds there are, how many Christians, how many Druze, how many Sunnis. It's basically an election is a census. Because in the current context where you have essentially zero civil society, where you have zero institutions, where people don't think in terms of issues, but they think in terms of tribal affiliations, elections will simply give you a census of the country. Now, that sounds bad to say tribal affiliations. It's a little, you know, if a Syrian walked in here today and I said, you know, isn't it true that it's basically sectarian and tribal? He would really not like that. And the reason he wouldn't like that is, you know, it just sounds so primitive to describe that. And yet, I think you have to understand that when governments don't do their jobs, and when there is no perception of kind of order in a country, order that is being managed by governmental structures, people revert to something else. And what they revert to are sectarian or tribal affiliations. And so it is not to say that Syria will always be characterized by sectarian or tribal affiliations. It is to say in these tough times, nobody's kind of taken a chance. No Sunni is going to say, well, you know, I sort of like that Alawite leader. I'm going to vote for that guy. No one trusts that there could be a kind of civil society that comes out of that. And again, it doesn't mean that that's the state of affairs for the rest of history. But I think the first thing you got to be when you look at these messes on the ground is be a little realistic about what to expect. So my own view on Syria is that this is one of the nastiest problems we have out there, but that it needs to be addressed through a diplomatic process where we determine, and even certainly in consultation with the parties on the ground, but you don't necessarily wait for them to make all the decisions. You kind of have to nudge them in the right direction, where Syria is probably going to have a very federalist structure. That is, Damascus cannot be running Aleppo anymore. You cannot have a sort of unitary government running people who don't accept in any way, shape, or form the legitimacy of that unitary government. So you'd have to have some kind of territorial federalism where the Christians sort of feel that they'll be okay with their churches and they won't be told that they have to be turned into mosques or won't be discriminated against, etc. You have to have a situation where the Alawites, who are kind of like Shia but not Shia, as they'll hastily point out to you, need to be able to have their mosques and their mosques not disturbed by the Sunni mosques or Sunni clerics. So you have to kind of work some kind of decentralization. I suspect you would need some kind of parliament where, you know, if you have a one-person, one-vote parliament in Syria, you would end up with getting, the Sunnis would have the majority and they'd win every, pass every law they want to pass. So you've got to have another chamber. How would you constitute the chamber? In the United States, we did it by 2 senators. So you got 2 senators from New York and you got 2 senators from Wyoming. One of whom will not be Liz Cheney this year, I guess. So, I mean, that doesn't look fair. You know, why should Wyoming have the same as New York? But it's an effort. I mean, and our founding fathers all worked this out, you know, a couple hundred years ago. I mean, an effort to try to protect people who felt they'd be overrun by the majority. So probably Syria needs some kind of upper chamber, whether that would be done territorially as we do, or whether it would be done by saying, okay, Sunnis, you're going to get 2, the Alawites are going to get 2, the Christians are going to get 2, or, you know, maybe make each 10 or something, and then create a circumstance where if 2 of these national groups, let's say the Alawites and the Druze, don't want to go along with some legislation otherwise supported by the majority, that they could veto it because there would be 2 national groups or national groups as accepted in the upper chamber, or maybe you want to have it as 3 national groups, something like that. It takes a while to hammer this out. It will not be hammered out by the Syrians. And for people to say, well, isn't this a little high-handed? Isn't this a little 19th century? You're sort of imposing all this on the Syrians. Shouldn't you allow the Syrians to work this? I say, if the Syrians can stop killing women and children and stop, you know, dropping chemical weapons on each other, fine, work it out. But once you've put yourself in that kind of position, you've basically shown your incompetence in sort of moving ahead. And I think the international community has a responsibility to protect, to use that UN concept, and and the necessity of really coming up with things that will protect people, protect minorities, and protect majorities as well. So I don't think we're anywhere near that at this point, but I think there is an understanding that we're not going to go forward on the basis that we have today, and that we have to get serious about a Syrian settlement. It's not just about Syria right now. It's metastasized into Lebanon. It's metastasized back into Iraq. I mean, to think that Iraq is now an importer of violence as opposed to an exporter of violence is something new. But when you see that a group of Shia pilgrims in Iraq have just been blown up by some Al-Qaeda operation, and don't forget that Al-Qaeda is an extremist Sunni group. And when you see that some of these Shia have been killed by these Sunnis, don't assume that this is because somehow the Shia-led government in Iraq has failed to, you know, make enough concessions to the Sunnis. It is true that Prime Minister Maliki of Iraq has not done enough to reach out to the Sunnis, etc. It's absolutely, you can certainly criticize him for that. He's a very difficult person to deal with. You know, I always say if that guy ever had charisma, it cleared up a long time ago, because not too many signs of it now. Very difficult, very unpleasant person, but I submit to you that what is happening in Iraq today is not because the Iraqi leadership has failed to give the deputy sports ministry position to the Sunnis. It has to do with a metastasized Syrian conflict. And if we want to calm down Iraq, we, the international community, we better start thinking about calming down Syria, because it will go on and on. These people have an appetite for this stuff, which is quite extraordinary. So I think we're coming around to the understanding that this is not going to work unless we can kind of put together some plan ahead of time. And certainly I spent a lot of my time trying to convince people that this is enough, and there have just been too many innocents murdered in this conflict. And if it goes on, it's not just going to go on in Syria or be spilled over in Lebanon and Iraq. It's going to be spilled over other places as well. So I think we've got our work cut out for ourselves. But of course, in the last 2 weeks, who's seen an article on Syria? There's been nothing. And the answer is that in our sort of one-burner stove of international issues, we've all now we're looking at the at the stew being cooked in Ukraine. Ukraine, for those of you who followed it over the years, it's been more of a proposition than a country. It has a neighbor, Russia, whose people generally, and this is not everybody, but whose people generally see Ukrainians as nothing but sort of peasant Russians. They don't accept the notion of a distinct identity as Ukrainian, apart from being Russian and living on this Ukraine this landscape. It's a little like in Croatia, you had these Serbs living in a place called Krajina, same root as Ukraine, kraj meaning end, sort of borderland. So you had these borderland Serbs, and the Croats said, well, they think they're Serbs, but they're really Croats. So you have that same kind of thing going on with the Russians, simply not accepting Ukrainian identity, and moreover, frankly, being very skeptical of Ukraine's rights as a nation state. Right now, I think for anyone turning on the television or reading the news, the issue has come down to the Russian Black Sea fleet and the location of Crimea. One thing I've known, I hope this won't happen to you in medical school, but for me, all the political science I learned has been relegated to history, and now it turns out all the history I learned is now today's political science. I never thought I'd hear about 19th century issues like Crimea as I'm hearing about them today. But basically, the Russians took it about 300 years ago, and they consider it very, very Russian. On the occasion of the 300th anniversary of Ukraine's joining with Tsarist Russia, Khrushchev in 1954 thought it would be a nice thing to present Crimea to Ukraine as kind of a gift on the occasion of their 300th birthday. It kind of, to understand communism is to understand banality, and there's a lot of banality with a guy like Khrushchev. We all know about the shoe on the table. That was the least of it. And so you have a situation where, certainly Khrushchev never thought in a million years that having Crimea located in the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union meant anything, and certainly he didn't think that it would mean that somehow this Crimea would be in another state. Even Yeltsin, as he was busy trying to destroy the sort of remaining accoutrements of the Soviet Union, including this, Gorbachev's approach, etc., Yeltsin was very busy destroying that, and he accepted some help from Ukrainian nationalists in the process, because Ukrainian nationalists also wanted out of the Soviet Union big time. So when the issue of Crimea came up, Yeltsin thought, well, okay, Ukraine will be independent, but it won't be for long, and eventually they'll come back. So he negotiated some basing rights, but that was about it. So now we have a situation that Ukraine's still around as an independent country. But the other thing, and the thing that the Russians have always claimed, is the Ukrainians are not, they don't know how to run themselves as a state. Well, that's not for Russia really to judge. I mean, that's really for the Ukrainian voters to judge. But certainly, if you want to be critical about what Ukraine has been doing in the last 20 years, there's a lot to be critical about. They have one inept followed by one corrupt government after another. I have, for 20 years, and you can go back through this, you're going to be hard-pressed to find anyone who really knew what he or she was doing in Ukraine. Yulia Tymoshenko, for example, who emerged on Saturday night in a wheelchair, having been jailed by Yanukovych. Yanukovych is thought of as a big friend of Russia. He's actually, Putin actually opposed him and supported Yulia Tymoshenko. So Yulia shows up and she's, okay, it's my turn. And lo and behold, the people in the street, the people out on the square, the Maidan, were saying, well, we're not sure we want to do this deal again. So, but in the meantime, who's really come forward to run Ukraine? Not too many people. And instead, Ukraine has now kind of thrown itself at the tender mercies of the international community, that doesn't really know what to do about the situation, mainly because, no one likes Yeltsin, and no one wants to deal, no one likes Putin, and no one wants to deal with Putin. But in the absence of dealing with Putin, there's really no one else to deal with. So I submit to you what is going to happen in the coming days, and I think it began today in Paris, is we're going to begin to do a deal with the Russians. Now, on the good news side, Putin had a meeting yesterday, had a press conference yesterday, in which he made fairly clear that he's not going to try to take all of the eastern provinces of Ukraine that are Russian-speaking. Now, just because you're Russian-speaking doesn't mean you're less Ukrainian than Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. And if you look at the actual map of Ukraine, and what is today called Western Ukraine, that was about 100 years ago part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then it went to Poland, and then Stalin thought his Soviet Union should be a little further west, so he took it from Poland and compensated the Poles with part of Eastern Germany. I mean, I just mentioned this to you because you've got to be a little skeptical of when people talk territory as if it was set down during the period of Adam and Eve or something. I mean, territory does get swapped around. So, but what is clear is that there's a lot of Ukrainian nationalism. Putin is correct that some of this nationalism is kind of unpleasant. And for those of you who know Polish history, you know that those were Ukrainian units of the Wehrmacht who actually destroyed the Polish, the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, you're aware that some of these Ukrainians were not very nice, but that doesn't mean that Ukrainian nationalism is all Nazism or something. But I think the upshot of this crisis in the last week or two is that Ukrainian nationalism, in the sense that Ukraine needs to go forward toward the West, is stronger than ever before. And I think I'm of the view that Putin has made a bad decision. And I'm also of the view that we need to manage that bad decision and try to get that decision reversed through diplomatic means and not go to some kind of full-blown Cold War. Now, I'm a nostalgic sort of person. I mean, when I saw that Judy Collins was visiting Denver, my wife Julie got me tickets to go hear Judy Collins. I love this stuff. But I'm not so nostalgic about the Cold War. And I think we ought to be a little careful when people start talking about what a wonderful thing it would be if we can get back to the Cold War, because at least the lines were clear and we know what we're dealing with, and there'd be no sense that, Russia is somehow anything but our implacable foe. I think under Putin, there is no question that Russian democracy is heading in the wrong direction. No question at all. There's a lot to be concerned about in Russia today. But I support those who have been reluctant to kind of throw Russia in the deep freeze, because I think in the long run, Russia can only succeed when it embraces the West. Russia can only succeed when it kind of makes its decision that it needs to be one of the great powers of the West, and not a sort of imperial power that kind of moves eastward. And I'm using East and West in sort of metaphorical terms. But I think we need to be a little careful about wanting to throw Russia eastward and throw away the key as well. So we've had some indications in the last few days that Putin, and by the way, Putin's Russia is a lot more difficult to deal with than Yeltsin's Russia. I mean, I dealt with those guys during the Kosovo and Bosnian times, and they weren't easy, but they were a lot less pugnacious than the Putin team that we have to deal with, where anything you suggest, they will come back at you just to be negative. I mean, these are people who are very difficult to deal with. But I'm pleased that there's some indication that Putin is not going to try to dismember Ukraine. Now, mind you, I don't think dismembering Ukraine is necessarily a good idea for him, because Western Ukraine, if it's unbridled by a sort of Eastern Ukraine that tends to be more caring about its relationship with Russia, and if you have a Western Ukraine that's kind of free of that kind of more Russian-leaning, although I don't want to overdo that, you'll end up with a Western Ukraine that puts up its hand and asks to join NATO like yesterday. And so if Putin is worried about NATO being on his immediate border, he will get NATO on his immediate border the minute he tries to hive off Ukraine or eastern Ukraine. So there are some indications that he's not interested in that. Even this hideous thing where he's got all these soldiers out there with no insignia on them, and it's really pretty thuggish stuff, because he's not even admitting that they're Russian troops. He's saying, well, they're just people with store-bought uniforms, and they're just out there protecting their homes. The good news of that is he's basically denying that the Russian army has ever been there, and that does kind of help you get back to where you were before. So I think these next couple of days are going to be critical. My own view is that the United States, we spend a little too much time insulting foreigners who don't agree with us, and I don't think that necessarily helps get us back to where we want to be. We've had, Putin described as, I think, insane and not delirious. I'm sorry? Delusional. Maybe that'll help, but maybe it won't. I think we ought to tone it down a little. And I also think it's important to let our Secretary of State do his job. And to some extent even let our President do his job, because I think when you're in these kind of really tough foreign policy moments, I think it's important to kind of, I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy, but I think, supporting your team out there might be a good way to start, because when you don't, it makes us look a little confused and a little sort of hard to deal with. And so, and I think we get taken advantage of when we're seen as hopelessly divided. So I hope that people, whether in the media or, among people who don't like the president for whatever reason, can kind of tone it down, because I think these are going to be critical days. The upshot of this should be a couple of things. We need to get Russia out, the Russian forces, special forces actually, out of Crimea. We need an understanding that Crimea will continue to have the Russian base in it, but will continue to be administered by Ukraine. There was also some good news yesterday when it appears the Crimeans have kind of pulled back from the idea they want to have an autonomy vote. And if they did an autonomy vote today, they might vote to join Russia. And then where would we be? We could say that the vote was no good, but those are not easy moments. So if they can postpone that whole fraught situation, I think that would be helpful. The European Union has stepped up today with a $15 billion support package for Ukraine, and I think Ukrainian, what really brought on this whole problem was the demise of the Ukrainian economy, because Yanukovych, I've said Ukrainian leaders have often been corrupt or they've been incompetent. He's actually a 2-in-1 example. I think and John Kerry came to Kiev with a $1 billion package of loan guarantees, which is really what Ukraine needs. We've got to be careful that in talking to the Russians in Paris, which is what's happening today, the Ukrainians, who really feel quite abused by the Russians, and for good reasons, that they don't feel that deals are being cut over their heads 1,000 miles away. So you could cut a nice deal with the Russians and then have the Ukrainians say, no way, we're going to accept that. We prefer to fight, or we prefer to do whatever. So I think, we've got to be careful, and that's why I thought it was a very good choreography, which is important in diplomacy as well as ballet, that Kerry first went to Kiev, and he put wreaths down, and he showed he loved the Ukrainians. Then he goes and meets the Russians. So I think that was important, because otherwise the Ukrainians are, what's he doing? Cutting a deal against us? So there needs to be a really, careful, tight choreography on that. I think that's going about right. So And then the Ukrainians need to, in choosing a new government, remember they have a provisional government. And by the way, that whole process of getting Yanukovych out of town was not very pretty. I mean, you talk about people with unmarked uniforms and in ski masks, and then the way by which, remember, he had a pretty big parliamentary majority in Ukraine, and suddenly they all disappeared. Well, you have to ask yourself the question, how did that happen? And I can assure you there was a lot of nasty intimidation in that process. So I think as the Ukrainians go forward, they need to get to a government that is able to say that they're representing Eastern Ukraine. And by the way, there have been, some of the acts of this provisional Ukrainian assembly have not been very nice. For example, getting rid of Russian as a second language or as an official language in Ukraine and replacing it with only Ukrainian, that is not Ukrainian and Russian, but only Ukrainian. That's not very helpful. So they need to kind of calm down, get a more inclusive government. I think it's got to be provisional pending elections of some kind at some point in the future, but they need to make sure that the Eastern Ukrainians are handled. There's a lot of talk about we need some kind of monitoring group, there's an international organization called the OSCE that most European countries are part of, and the OSCE would go monitor how the Russian minority is being treated in Ukraine. I submit to you it would be kind of not only a waste of time, but believe me, there would be so many stupid incidents happening every day with some, guy out in a checkpoint not knowing who these guys are. And next thing you know, CNN is breathlessly reporting that they're harassing the monitors, etc. So I've been there, done that, and I don't recommend it for Ukraine right now. So I think we're kind of in the middle of a crisis, but I think the best way back is to kind of slow down a little, work with everybody involved, and try to get back to the status quo ante, difficult as that may be, and try to avoid making mistakes that are going to be a long time in getting fixed. We need Russia in Syria. We need Russia if we're going to get the Iranians to give up their nuclear aspirations. We even need Russia if we're going to get the North Koreans to give up their nuclear ambitions. So we need Russia for a number of things. We need a Russia that kind of works with the international community. That's certainly been the drill for 20 years. And as much as I can blame the Russians for what's happened in the last 2 weeks, I do have to acknowledge that Russia has a real interest in Ukraine, maybe even more than some, talking head in, Washington, D.C. cares about Ukraine. I mean, we have a lot of people talking about Ukraine who couldn't have spelled the word, a few weeks ago. So this is important to Russia, and we need to kind of work through this and work through it in a calm head. So anyway, I've done Syria and Ukraine and all kinds of other screwy situations I could talk about, but anyway, been a great audience, and I'll do some questions.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah.
So, yes.
So you mentioned going back to Syria that the road ahead involves sort of a political game that's run by the international community.
It's proposed by the international community, yeah.
I think that the real problem is that al-Assad is not leaving.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
So what's the solution to getting rid of al-Assad?
That's a very fair question. My own view is you can't invite someone to a political negotiation and say, hey, we want to invite you. That's the good news. Bad news is the purpose is to get rid of you. And, I don't think he's going to want to do that. So I think, and yet I don't see how he can rule Syria in the future. I really don't. I mean, I would even be able to view that there ought to be some international tribunal he's put in front of, especially for that chemical weapons. I mean, my own view on that, and I'm no bomb-dropping kind of person, but, when someone starts using weapons that have been banned for 100 years, it's time to, send a very clear signal, and we didn't do it. So my own view is on this issue, we should maybe talk about the political arrangements for the future and address the issue of who should play the role, who should be the prime minister, who should be the president, who should be the head of the parliament. Put off the issue of personalities. I think if we actually got agreement, and by the way, we're nowhere near agreement, if we actually got an agreement of what Syria would like would look like in the future. That is, it would be this federalist thing that I described. It would have, some kind of different structures in Damascus. If lo and behold we actually got that agreement, and then at the last, then we can kind of turn and say, Assad, I don't think this is for you. And I think we could get through that. But when you start by saying, well, we need your people here, but, we're going to send you to the War Crimes Tribunal. I just, I mean, just think of doing that individually. It doesn't work. So I think it has to be something like that. Postpone the issue. We're never going to, we, the United States, will never agree to Assad being the president of Syria in the future because, we've kind of invested in the fact that he should not. And yet, I think all we have to say is the issue of who does what is for the final stage of negotiation. If someone says, well, what about Assad? The issue of who does what in the final stage. Well, what if Assad wants to wants to be the president? Let's say, our position is well known. By the way, that's a nice diplomatic nicety. You just say our position is well known. You don't have to repeat that Assad needs to go. You just say our position is well known, and we believe that the first phase of these negotiations should be on the structures. This is not about people, it's about structures. Well, what about Assad? Hypothetical, we can talk about that later. That's how I'd handle it. I remember one time getting pressed on that. Well, if your position's well known, could you repeat it to us? And I said, well, look it up on our website. So.
I'm curious, with this proposed solution mediated by the international community, how would you ensure that the international community, people like Russia and China and the United States, wouldn't take economic advantage of Syria?
Well, I don't think Syria is such a big thing that you'd want to take economic advantage of it. I don't think it's such a big deal out there. I think the problem is trying to reach a consensus, because anything that, if the international community is going to work something out, you need to get the Russians on board, and the Russians often say no just for the sport of it. So I think it would be difficult. But I think we ought to bear in mind that Russia is not interested in a continued crisis in Syria. I think, Russia, they have interest in the whole region, and they know that as long as the Syria thing goes and boils along, you get, you've got a serious sectarian conflict all over the region. So I think there's a reason to believe that some of the great powers, China, Russia, etc., would want to see it solved. We would need to avoid saying things like the U.S. plan. That doesn't help. So you might say make it the UN plan, and Ban Ki-moon, he's a pretty good diplomat, the Korean guy who's Secretary General. So I think you'd have to kind of get the Russians and the Chinese on board with the notion that this was something the Americans weren't trying to do, and with the understanding that I think everyone wants to put this one in the rearview mirror, because Syria, it's a tough situation, and these are very tough people, and they'll kill each other for many years to come. I mean, they're not tired of it at all. Yes?
You mentioned that in Syria, when governance is lacking, there's kind of a aversion to...
not just Syria, but as a general proposition, Right.
What makes Ukraine different that a vote could be useful when there's such a big divide between the Ukrainians and the Russians?
Well, I think there needs to be a provisional process put together, but I don't think it needs to be put together, overnight by, some people in ski masks. So I think you do need some kind of provisional government that somehow captures the interests of eastern Ukraine and somehow shows that, Ukraine understands that Russia is interested in this issue. I'm not suggesting they go appoint some pro-Russian stooge, but I think there needs to be an understanding that Russia has a dog in this fight. But as for eventual elections, I would not recommend that for a while because of precisely what you're suggesting. That is, the atmosphere is much too fraught and polarized, etc., to go ahead with elections. I mean, of all the accoutrements of democracy, I mean, that are essential to democracy, and elections are essential to democracy. But in some respects, as essential as they are, they may be the least important aspect of democracy, because in the absence of institutions and a sort of and a respect for the interests of people as minorities who are still citizens, I think elections can be a problem. And I think if you go around the world, people have kind of only read half the memo on democracy, and they think, I mean, look at this Erdogan in Turkey, where he does have a majority, but that's what democracy is. Not just about taking care of the people who voted for you, it's about taking care of everybody and giving everybody equal status under the law. And so I think often in these with these dictators, they do win elections. Putin wins, he had over 50%. And believe me, I know there's always this kind of urban bias with the international media. They're in Moscow and they go to some nice kid in Moscow. What do you think about Putin? Or, well, go out in those villages and ask what they think about Putin. They like him, So it's not that Putin didn't have a majority. He probably did. The problem is he has no interest in what that other 49% thinks. To coin a phrase. So I think in Ukraine they really need to kind of put off that the final election package and kind of work on getting the economy straightened out, getting the laws passed, etc. And it's very fraught right now, which is why if we go to Paris, I mean, if Lavrov and Kerry come out, well, we've solved it all. Ukrainians are not going to like that. So that has to be very carefully, as I said, choreographed. Yeah.
It sounds like you think that the way forward in Syria might be some kind of brokered power sharing agreement.
In Syria,
Sunni and maybe a third group. Can you point to any models where there was an internationally, formal power sharing agreement?
Bosnia. I mean, we even, it's kind of ridiculed by people today because we had this rotating presidency. The Serb, the Croat, the Bosniak, read Muslim. So that's an example. There's a lot of talk now that what was set up for Bosnia back in November '95 is a little passé, and Bosnia is kind of ready to not to have this kind of Sesame Street turn-taking, but rather have, elect a president who will, rule and then stand re-election. But at the time, it was the way to get through some, where people are so emotional and everyone hates each other and no one trusts each other, and so you kind of do this turn-taking. Lebanon's another example. Lebanon's an interesting example because the concept of Lebanon, they set up these things where you have the Christians, Muslim, Christian, Shia, Sunni. Those are the basic three groups in Lebanon. But one of the things they've never done in Lebanon is to have a census. And so the last census, and they use this last census as the way by which these positions are apportioned. I mean, for Americans, this is hard to take. I mean, we should, we should just have free elections. Doesn't matter what you represent. And it's kind of tribal. We don't like that. But this is kind of how it worked in Lebanon. But what's really weird about it is the census that they base this on is taken in 1936. And so, 1936. So why don't they just go in Lebanon and say, well, let's have another census? And the answer is there's a real concern. Christians are like that in Lebanon. A lot of Christians have left for a lot of reasons. And the Shia in Lebanon. And remember, every country in the Arab world is run by the Sunnis, except for Iraq and sort of Syria. So the Shia in Lebanon are believed to be way up in size compared to the Sunnis, and the Sunni states don't want to see that. So I'm not suggesting to you that it's ideal to do this kind of ethnic or sectarian spoil system, but I'm just saying there's no trust in institutions right now. the civil society, for all these, you'll be watching CNN and they'll have some Lebanese on there who speaks English better than I do, and you go, what's the, why are we doing these kinds of, ethnic or sectarian spoil system? The trouble is that person speaking to you on CNN represents about 3 other people, usually members of his or her family, and that's about it, And that's another thing to be aware of. I remember, Milosevic, the issue is always you get these people who say, well, we have no objection to Shia or to Alawites. I mean, look at our council. We have an Alawite right here. And how can you say that we, the Syrian opposition, oppose the Kurds? We have a Kurdish representative right here. The trouble is that Kurdish representative, that Alawite representative, they don't represent anybody. And I remember when, Milosevic used to do this on Kosovo. He'd say, why are you always supporting Rugova's Albanians in Kosovo? Rugova was the sort of informal president of Kosovo when it was still under Serbia. And he said, why do you support these Rugova separatists? You say you care about the Albanian majority, but I have Albanians on my delegation. We're sitting at this big dinner table. He goes, Mehmet. He points to some guy way to the left of the salt and pepper shakers, and Mehmet, you're Albanian, right? Yes, sir, I'm Albanian. See, Mehmet's on my staff here. So, it's such gross manipulation. I mean, Mehmet didn't represent anybody, probably not even his family, and so, so you got to be careful with that. And like the Sunnis in Iraq tried that with Ayat Alawi to put him forward against Maliki, and the Sunnis would say to the press, the Western press, and we don't believe in Sunnis. I mean, look, the head of our party is Ayat Alawi. Well, Alawi is about as Shia as I am. I mean, with due respect, he couldn't find Mecca if his life depended on it. And I like the guy, but he's not a Shia leader. So, you gotta, when these people come at you with this kind of stuff, you gotta, have your, what detector operating, So, yes, ma'am.
So I'm getting incredibly stressed here.
Oh, I didn't mean to do that.
And I have a very right-brained question to ask you, very right-brained. So you've been in this career, this wonderful career for your lifetime's work, and obviously diplomacy does work in some cases.
Yes.
Do you have any hope that it will really work in the Middle East? I personally, at this point, don't.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear something hopeful.
Yeah.
If there is something hopeful to be said.
Well, there are a lot of places that if you look at them, they were characterized by vicious wars for centuries, and they don't have any wars anymore. And I'm speaking of Western Europe. We look at Western Europe as one of the nicest places in the world, and it is. But, it wasn't in 1940. And yet, I think war between France and Germany today, I think is unthinkable and will be unthinkable for the rest of history. I really do. And so when, I was working on Macedonia, which stayed out of war, by the way. Macedonia, but historically, go back to 1912, 1913, miserable. And people cutting each other's throats all the time. And it's pretty peaceful now. I think if you can kind of take out some of the emotion, and I think that's one of the we live in an emotional age, very fraught age. Just dial it back a little and try to look at these things. They're not all algebraic equations, you can't always solve for X or something, but I think we can do a lot better job than getting up and calling Putin names. I can't stand the guy, but this has nothing to do with anything. We have to deal with him. And you have to deal with him, you have to deal with what he's coming at, and sometimes there are people, there's just no dealing with him, you got to go to war with him. Hitler would be in that category. I think if we kind of dial it down and kind of figure out what can be some arrangements at work, and be careful of saying he's a good guy and he's a bad guy, because the world isn't divided between good guys and bad guys, certainly not in those places. There's usually bad guys and worse guys, and so, I think you have to develop systems and approaches that bring a sense of calm and hope for a new generation that will be more interested in kind of moving forward than maybe some of their you know, left-brained parents. So.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we got it here because there's probably another class coming. So
Sure.
we
Okay.
really appreciate your
Okay.
time.